This isn't really a monster show. Really consider it that. We're different. Basically, it's a comedy more than it is any kind of horror or monster show. And we do different things.
One of the most beloved sitcoms in television history almost had a completely mute butler. Its star shaved his head in his own bathroom to get the role. Its iconic set was painted bright pink. And somewhere in Hollywood, a thief made off with a two-headed stuffed tortoise and a swordfish with a human leg sticking out of its mouth, and was never caught. The Addams Family premiered on ABC in September 1964 and ran for just 2 seasons. 64 episodes, gone by 1966. And yet 6 decades later, those finger snaps are still one of the most instantly recognizable sounds in pop culture history. But the show you think you know? You don't know the half of it. Today we are cracking open 15 genuinely strange, deeply weird, and occasionally jaw-dropping facts about the 1964 Addams Family that the show never wanted you to find out. From improvised catchphrases that rewrote television history to the future Oscar winner who was 11 years old and no one noticed, buckle in, because this family is even stranger behind the camera than in front of it. Let's get into it. Fact 1. Lurch's catchphrase was a complete accident. Let's start with the one that changes everything. You rang. 2 words, 3 syllables. One of the most iconic lines in the history of American television. And it almost never existed. Here's what most people don't know. When Ted Cassidy first stepped onto the set of The Addams Family in 1964, the character of Lurch, the towering, brooding butler who would become one of the show's most beloved figures, was written as completely mute, totally silent. Just like he appeared in Charles Addams's original New Yorker cartoons, where he existed only as a looming, wordless presence. The producers envisioned Lurch as someone who communicated purely through groans and gestures, an imposing shadow of a man, seen but never heard. Then came the pilot episode. Someone rang the bell to summon the butler, and Cassidy, in a moment of spontaneous creative decision-making that nobody had scripted, looked at the camera and in his naturally deep, measured, perfectly calibrated baritone, delivered 2 words. You rang. The crew lost it. The cast burst into laughter. Not polite laughter, the genuine, caught-off-guard kind that tells you something just landed perfectly. The producers looked at each other and immediately understood what had happened. They hadn't just caught lightning in a bottle. They'd caught it without even holding a bottle. The decision was made on the spot. Lurch would speak, not in long speeches. His dialogue would remain minimal and sparse, but those short, deadpan, perfectly timed lines delivered in Cassidy's unmistakable voice would become a defining feature of the show. Think about how close we came to never having it. One decision to stick to the original script, one actor who stayed quiet when the bell rang, and You Rang vanishes from television history forever. Instead, Cassidy reprised that line across animated series and the 1977 reunion special. It became his legacy, and it happened entirely by accident on what was supposed to be a routine day of filming. Ask yourself, how many of your favorite moments in culture exist only because someone decided, in a single unscripted second, to do something different? Fact 2. The mansion sat on a street named Addams. You could not make this up. When location scouts for the Addams Family were searching for the perfect Victorian exterior to use as the family's creepy home, they landed on a beautiful 19th-century house in the historic West Adams district of Los Angeles. Gothic bones, slightly eerie presence, exactly what they needed. The address was 21 Chester Place. What nobody realized until much later was that Chester Place hadn't always been called Chester Place. The street had been renamed multiple times over the decades. And at one specific point in its history, that exact house had stood on a street called Addams Street. The mansion chosen as the home of the Addams family had literally been located on a street named Addams. The house itself dated back to 1888, more than 75 years before the television show was even conceived. Over its lifetime, it had gone from Addams Street to West 25th Street, before finally becoming Chester Place when the exclusive residential area was developed. The scouts who chose it in 1964 had no idea about any of this history. They picked it because it looked right. The name connection was pure coincidence. Here's another layer. The production only used the actual house for exterior shots in the very first episode and the opening title sequence, the one where you see Gomez filing through the gate. For the remaining 63 episodes, they used a matte painting based on a photograph of the building, altered to add a 3rd floor and a Gothic tower because the real structure was only 2 stories tall. And then, almost as if the house had served its only purpose, it was demolished. In 1967, just 1 year after the show was canceled, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles filed for a demolition permit. The historic Victorian mansion was torn down to make way for a parking lot to serve the growing campus of Mount St. Mary's College, one of the most recognizable homes in television history, replaced by a parking lot. Fact 3. Jackie Coogan shaved his head and did his own makeup to get cast. The year is 1964. Jackie Coogan, a man who had been famous since the silent film era, a genuine Hollywood legend who had appeared alongside Charlie Chaplin in The Kid, walks into an audition room for a new ABC sitcom. The casting directors take one look at him and say, "No, he doesn't look right for the part. He's shown the door." Most people would have gone home, made peace with the rejection, and moved on. Jackie Coogan went home and grabbed a razor. He was a devoted fan of Charles Addams's original New Yorker cartoons and knew exactly, precisely, specifically what Uncle Fester was supposed to look like. So he sat down and transformed himself. He shaved his entire head completely bald, removing every last hair to match the character's distinctive appearance. Then he went further. Without professional makeup artists, without a wardrobe department, without any help whatsoever, he assembled his own costume and created his own makeup by hand. When he walked back into that audition room, the casting team didn't hesitate. The role was his on the spot, and there's a layer of poignancy here that makes this story hit differently when you know the full context. Jackie Coogan had been one of the most famous child actors in Hollywood history, and had infamously seen his enormous childhood earnings stolen by his own mother and stepfather, which was so egregious it literally led to the creation of the Coogan Law, California legislation that still protects child actors' earnings today. By the 1960s, his career had faded considerably. He needed this. And rather than wait for someone to give it to him, he shaved his head in his bathroom and went and took it. He played Uncle Fester for the entire 2-season run of the show, one of the most beloved performances in the series, built with a razor, a mirror, and pure determination. Fact 4. Ted Cassidy played 2 characters simultaneously. You already know about the Urang origin story, but Ted Cassidy's involvement in the Addams Family was even deeper and far stranger than most people ever realized. Because Cassidy wasn't just Lurch, he was also Thing, the mysterious disembodied hand that popped out of boxes throughout the Addams mansion, delivering mail, answering phones, assisting the family with tasks that required digits and a wrist. That was Ted Cassidy. The same man playing the 6'9" stoic butler was also the hand crawling out of wooden boxes in scene after scene after scene. He had a separate contract specifically for performing as Thing. And here's the part that really gets you. Cassidy was so committed to the role that he would sometimes travel all the way to the studio on days when Lurch wasn't even in the episode, solely to stick his hand out of a box for a few brief scenes. Think about that dedication for a moment. This was not a glamorous job. There were no close-ups of his face, no dialogue, just a hand. And he showed up anyway, every time. The obvious logistical problem came in scenes where both Lurch and Thing needed to appear simultaneously on screen. Since Cassidy was only one person, the production brought in assistant director Jack Voglin to perform as Thing whenever the script required both characters to interact in the same shot. So the next time you watch an episode where Lurch and Thing appear together, you now know that's 2 different people, and that for most of the series, the stoic butler and the helpful hand were the same performer. Cassidy's versatility and absolute commitment to both roles, no matter how small, made him one of the most valuable and quietly extraordinary members of the entire production. Fact 5. The set was decorated in bright pink. Close your eyes and picture the Addams Family living room. Dark walls, Gothic shadows, black and gray everywhere. A space that feels like it hasn't seen sunlight in decades. Now open your eyes, because that image is completely wrong. The actual set, the physical space where cast and crew filmed every single interior scene, was painted in bright pink. The furniture was teal. There were gold accents throughout, patterned rugs that would have looked perfectly at home in a cheerful suburban beach house. A TV Guide photographer who visited the set in 1964 captured it in full color, and the image is genuinely disorienting. It looks like an entirely different show. So why on earth did they do this? Black and white television. The show was filmed in black and white by deliberate choice. The producers wanted that vintage, eerie atmosphere. But here's the technical reality. Cameras and film stock of that era translated different colors into shades of gray in ways that weren't always predictable. If you painted walls dark gray or black, the on-screen result might look flat, muddy, or lose all definition. To get the appearance of darkness and shadow on screen, you needed specific colors, and those colors sometimes had to be vivid in real life. Pink walls and teal furniture, when stripped of color through the lens, photographed as exactly the dark, moody tones the show needed. There was also a practical bonus. Because the production team wasn't limited to genuinely dark or gothic colors, they could raid the studio's existing prop warehouses for anything that would photograph well in black and white, regardless of what it actually looked like. This included furniture and decorations pulled from completely unrelated productions, including pieces from the recently wrapped musical film The Unsinkable Molly Brown, which had absolutely nothing to do with Gothic families. The most visually dark set on 1960s television was, in reality, one of the most colorful. Fact 6. ABC rejected the name Pubert as too sexual. When the producers sat down with cartoonist Charles Addams in 1964 to work through names for the television characters, Addams having never given them official names during their decades-long New Yorker run, they hit an unexpected wall with the family's son. Addams had a name in mind. He was enthusiastic about it. The name was Pubert, a deliberate, darkly comedic play on the word puberty that fit perfectly alongside Morticia, Fester, and Lurch. ABC's response was immediate and unambiguous. Absolutely not. Too risque. Too sexually suggestive for primetime family television in the 1960s. The network censors of that era maintained strict standards, and a character name that sounded that close to puberty was simply off the table. Addams pushed back. The name fit his vision, but eventually, reluctantly, he landed on Pugsley, derived from the word pug, meaning an ill-tempered or quarrelsome person. It wasn't as sharp as Pubert. It lacked that particular dark wordplay, but it suggested an unpleasant quality that fit the mischievous character, and ABC approved it. Actor Ken Weatherwax played Pugsley for the show's entire run. But here's the punchline. Pubert didn't disappear. Nearly 3 decades later, when the second Addams Family film went into production, the filmmakers finally gave Addams's original name its moment. In 1993's Addams Family Values, Gomez and Morticia welcome a third child, a baby boy, and they name him Pubert Addams. What had been deemed shockingly inappropriate for 1964 network television became a beloved inside joke for franchise fans by 1993. The name Addams always intended finally made it to the screen, just 30 years late and through the back door. Fact 7. John Astin originally auditioned for Lurch. Here's a casting near miss that would have fundamentally altered the entire show. When John Astin first came in for the Addams Family, he wasn't being considered for the role of Gomez, the passionate, train-obsessed, deeply romantic patriarch who became the heart of the series. He was being looked at for Lurch, the silent, towering, monosyllabic butler. Astin had recently appeared in a film called The Wheeler Dealers, produced by Filmways, the same company behind the Addams Family, and that connection gave him first consideration for one of 3 projects the company was developing. When they offered him Lurch, the original concept actually positioned the butler as the show's main character. Astin's problem: he couldn't envision it. He was honest about his doubts in a follow-up meeting with executive producer David Levy. The role required a stoic, physically imposing, largely silent presence, and something about that just didn't fit the way Astin understood his own abilities and instincts as a performer. Rather than walk away from him entirely, the producers paused and reconsidered, and they saw something in Astin, an energy, a natural warmth, a comic physicality that suggested a completely different role entirely. They moved him to Gomez, and Astin, a genuine fan of Charles Addams's original cartoons who had admired the work for years, stepped into the role that would define his career. Meanwhile, Lurch went to Ted Cassidy, the one man in Hollywood who was both 6 feet 9 inches and capable of making 2 words into an immortal catchphrase. 2 roles, 2 men, 1 swap, and the show became exactly what it was supposed to be. Fact 8. Vic Mizzy sang all 3 vocal parts himself. Da-da-da-dum, snap-snap. You know exactly what that sounds like. You probably just heard it in your head. That theme song is one of the most recognizable pieces of music in television history, and it was performed almost entirely by one man. talking to himself in a recording studio. Composer Vic Mizzy was hired to create the music for the show, and he didn't just write the melody and lyrics. He performed every single vocal part you hear in the opening credits through a recording technique called multi-tracking, layering his own voice 4 separate times to create the sound of a full chorus. Why? Budget. ABC executives were cutting costs wherever they could during production, and hiring professional vocal talent to perform the theme song represented an expense the network wasn't enthusiastic about. Producer David Levy pushed hard for Mizzy specifically, insisting the show deserved the best possible composer. Mizzy's solution satisfied both the creative ambition and the financial constraint. He'd just do it all himself. He recorded the main melody, then went back in and sang the same lyrics again at different harmonies, layer upon layer, until the multi-tracked result sounded like a group performance. The only other voice in the theme belongs to Ted Cassidy, playing Lurch, adding his deep bass interjections of neat, sweet, and petite at exactly the right moments to give the song its perfectly eerie punctuation. 1 composer, 1 actor, 4 vocal tracks. The result became one of the most enduring television themes ever recorded. The next time those finger snaps hit, you'll hear them a little differently. Fact 9. Cousin Itt didn't exist in the original comics. This one genuinely surprises people. Cousin Itt, the diminutive, floor-length hair-covered, bowler hat-wearing, high-pitched, gibberish-speaking family member who seems like such an essential part of the Addams Family universe, was not in Charles Addams's original cartoons. The character was invented specifically for the television show by producer David Levy and didn't even appear until episode 20 of the first season. How did Levy come up with it? He had come across a single-panel sketch Addams had drawn showing a hairy creature on the telephone, captioned, "This is it speaking." That one image, a throwaway drawing, not part of the main strip, lodged in Levy's imagination and became the seed for an entirely new character. The result was Cousin Itt, brought to life by actor Felix Silla, who stood 3 feet 6 inches tall and got the role after attending a casting call in Los Angeles. No audition required. They saw him. They gave him the job. The original costume was built from real human hair. That lasted until the production team realized it created a serious fire hazard, given how common smoking was on set at the time. They quickly switched to fire-retardant synthetic material. Here's the remarkable twist, though. Cousin Itt became such an instant hit with audiences that Charles Addams himself eventually began incorporating the character into his later comic strips. A television invention that worked its way backward into the source material. The adaptation influenced the original. And in every version of the Addams Family since, animated series, feature films, stage productions, Cousin Itt has been there, as if the character had always existed, created in a production meeting in 1964, and now inseparable from the family forever. Fact 10. Most of the bizarre props were stolen after cancellation. When the Addams Family wrapped production in 1966 after 64 episodes, the set was left standing at General Service Studios in Hollywood. And that set was something else. Over 2 seasons, the production had accumulated an extraordinary collection: taxidermied animals, antique furniture, suits of armor, medieval torture equipment, and an array of specifically strange objects that gave the Addams Mansion its distinctive character. Among the standouts, a mounted swordfish head with a human leg sticking out of its mouth, a stuffed 2-headed giant tortoise, countless one-of-a-kind oddities, some purchased from antique shops, others built from scratch by the prop department for the show alone. When the set was closed down, someone broke in. According to cast members speaking years later during DVD commentary recordings, an unidentified thief managed to access the studio lot after cancellation and made off with the bulk of the show's most distinctive props. Quickly, quietly, with apparent knowledge of what was worth taking and when the set would be unguarded. Not a single stolen item was ever recovered. To this day, nobody knows who took them or where they ended up. The swordfish with the leg, gone. The 2-headed tortoise, gone. Dozens of unique, irreplaceable pieces of television history, either sitting in someone's private collection or long since lost, with no record of their location. Some of the props that weren't stolen were eventually sold off or repurposed for other productions, but the majority of what made the Addams Mansion visually unforgettable simply vanished. There are photographs, there is footage, and that's all that remains. Somewhere out there, someone has a swordfish with a human leg sticking out of its mouth, and they're not telling anyone about it. Fact 11. The exterior mansion was demolished for a parking lot. We touched on this in Fact 2, but the full story deserves its own moment. The real Victorian house used for exterior shots, 21 Chester Place, the former resident of a street called Adam, was built in 1888. It stood for nearly 80 years as a stunning example of Victorian architecture before the wrecking crews arrived. In 1967, just 1 year after the show was cancelled, the Roman Catholic Archbishop of Los Angeles filed for a demolition permit. The building was cleared to accommodate a recreational track for the growing campus of Mount St. Mary's College. That Gothic mansion, the one that appeared in the opening title sequence of every single episode, was reduced to rubble so people would have a place to park. What makes this particularly strange is how little the production had actually used it. Only the very first episode and the opening title sequence ever used the real house. For the rest of the series, the production relied on a matte painting, a 30 by 4-inch photograph of the building, altered by a painter from the Howard Anderson Company, who added a third floor with a mansard roof and a Gothic tower to give it the imposing silhouette the real building lacked. The house that gave the show its visual anchor existed on screen for approximately 1 episode. Its painted, altered, enhanced version became the iconic image burned into viewers' memories. And by 1967, the real thing was gone. All that remains is the altered matte painting, some footage from the pilot, and the knowledge that a piece of television history is currently underneath a parking surface in Los Angeles. Fact 12. Ted Cassidy was deeply insecure about his height. Here is the human story underneath the monster. Ted Cassidy, the man who turned 6 feet 9 inches into one of television's most beloved physical presences, spent a significant portion of his early life deeply ashamed of that same height. Growing up in Philippi, West Virginia, Cassidy wasn't just tall for his age. He was extraordinarily tall in a way that made him an outsider everywhere he went. By his freshman year of high school, he was only 11 years old and already large enough to play on both the football and basketball teams, competing against students years older than him. What sounds impressive in retrospect felt isolating in the moment. He was different, visibly, inescapably, unavoidably different. And in adolescence, different is rarely something to celebrate. The unwanted attention followed him into adulthood. He worked as a radio DJ in Dallas, then began appearing on local television, always aware that he was the one who didn't fit the frame. Before the Addams Family, he had spent years auditioning for parts while navigating the way his height complicated almost every room he walked into. And then Lurch happened. The very thing that had made him feel out of place for the first 30-plus years of his life became his defining professional asset.
Lurch, how would you like to be a video's accompanist?
The quality that had once made people stare became the reason millions of viewers tuned in every week. He went from a man who felt too big for the world to a character the world couldn't get enough of. Ted Cassidy's story is a reminder that the traits we spend years trying to minimize are sometimes the exact things we were supposed to be known for. The source of his deepest insecurity became the foundation of his greatest success. Fact 13. The show and the Munsters refused to share guest stars. The Addams Family premiered on ABC on Friday, September 18, 1964. 6 days later, on September 24th, CBS debuted The Munsters. 2 networks, 2 shows about macabre, loving, eccentric monster families, premiering 6 days apart. And the television rivalry that followed was stranger than most people remember. Both shows made an active, deliberate decision to blacklist any guest star who had appeared on the competing series. If an actor worked on The Munsters, they were off-limits for the Addams Family, and vice versa. This wasn't casual or unspoken. It was a conscious effort to draw a clear line in the public's mind between 2 shows that audiences persistently lumped together. John Astin, who played Gomez, gave multiple interviews during the show's run, arguing that the 2 series were fundamentally different in concept. His argument: the Munsters were literally monstrous. Frankenstein's monster, a vampire, a werewolf, but with completely ordinary suburban values and concerns. The Addams Family, meanwhile, looked like normal humans, but lived by an entirely inverted worldview, celebrating darkness and finding conventional tastes suspicious and bizarre. It's actually a sharp distinction, but the viewing public never really bought it. For decades, the two shows have been remembered as essentially the same thing. And here's the kicker that makes the whole rivalry feel almost cosmically resolved. Both shows were canceled during the same week in 1966. The guest star embargo, the competing interviews, the deliberate differentiation, all of it ended together, simultaneously, as if the network executives had simply decided to bury both of them at once. They lived together. They died together. Fact 14. An 11-year-old Jodie Foster voiced Pugsley in a Scooby-Doo crossover. In 1972, 6 years after the original series ended, the Addams Family crossed over with Scooby-Doo and the Mystery Gang in a new Scooby-Doo movies episode titled Wednesday is Missing. Most of the original cast returned to voice their characters: John Astin as Gomez, Carolyn Jones as Morticia, Jackie Coogan as Uncle Fester, Ted Cassidy as Lurch. The family was back together, just animated.
There will be no more of this. If anything happens to Cousin Itt, the play is off.
The children's roles needed to be recast for the animated format. The voice of Pugsley Addams went to a child actress who was, at the time, relatively unknown to most audiences. Her name was Jodie Foster. She was 11 years old. This episode served as a backdoor pilot for a full Addams Family animated series that premiered in 1973, and Foster continued voicing Pugsley for all 16 episodes of that short-lived cartoon. The animated versions of the characters were drawn in the style of Charles Addams's original New Yorker cartoons rather than as caricatures of the live-action cast, giving the series a distinctive look that honored the source material. Jodie Foster would go on to win 2 Academy Awards for The Accused in 1989 and The Silence of the Lambs in 1991, becoming one of the most acclaimed actresses in Hollywood history. Her early career includes a Saturday morning cartoon where she voiced a character named after a word that ABC had once found too for primetime television. The Addams Family contains multitudes. Fact 15. Charles Addams preferred Rapelli over Gomez. We end where the family begins, with the patriarch. When it came time to give the characters official names for the television series, Charles Addams had a specific suggestion for the family's father. He wanted to call him Rapelli, a clever, deliberately off-putting play on the word repellent, designed to fit alongside Morticia, which evokes mortality, Fester, which literally means to decay, and Lurch. Addams couldn't quite settle on the character's heritage. He thought if the patriarch were Spanish, Gomez would be the right name. If Italian, Rapelli would fit better. Both names were technically surnames rather than first names, but Addams wasn't particularly concerned with that technicality. He wanted something that felt right for who this person was. In the end, he did something genuinely unusual for a creator of his stature. He handed the decision to the actor. John Astin, a longtime admirer of the Addams cartoons who had read them for years before being cast, was given the choice between Gomez and Rapelli and asked to pick whichever felt right for the character he was building. Astin chose Gomez.
Maybe he'd give us pear-shaped tones if we gave him a pear-shaped head.
And with that choice, he created something none of the other character names managed. A patriarch with a name that carries no morbid meaning whatsoever. Morticia evokes death. Fester means rot. Lurch suggests stumbling imbalance. Pugsley implies bad temper. And Gomez? Just a name. Warm, passionate, almost aggressively alive. A character who found joy in everything his world had to offer. It's possible that's exactly why it worked. In a family whose every other name signals something dark, the father's name signals nothing except himself. Charles Addams may have preferred Rapelli, but John Astin gave Gomez to the world. And the world, it turned out, was extremely glad to have him. 15 facts, 1 show, 2 seasons, 64 episodes, and a cultural footprint that has somehow outlasted almost everything else from its era. Here's what gets me about the Addams Family. It was canceled, quickly, after just 2 years on the air. By any standard metric of its time, it was a modest, brief run on a network schedule. And yet here we are, 60 years later, still talking about Lurch's catchphrase, and Cousin Itt's hair, and the pink walls, and the two-headed stuffed tortoise that someone stole in the dark and never returned. The show endures because it understood something that most television has always gotten backwards. The Addams Family weren't the strange ones. They were the ones who had figured out how to live, with genuine passion, unconditional love, and complete indifference to what anyone else thought was normal. Turns out that's timeless. Which of these 15 facts hit you hardest? Drop it in the comments. I genuinely want to know if you already knew any of these. And if you want more deep dives into the weird, hidden history behind the shows and films you grew up with, subscribe now and hit the bell because we have a lot more where this came from. You rang? We answered.